Hello, I'm Mike Morose, President of the Underground Railroad Society of Cass County. Cass County, Michigan played a major role in the Underground Railroad, especially in Penn, Calvin, and Porter Township, once known as Youngs Prairie. This story was almost lost, but thanks to the Underground Railroad Society of Cass County and our supporting community, this amazing story about courageous people doing what was right in the face of difficult circumstances is told to the world. Welcome.
Underground Railroad Society of Cass County presents Youngs Prairie, the Underground Railroad, and its legacy in Cass County, Michigan. Slavery started in the United States in the early 1600s. Each of the original 13 colonies had slaves. Quakers, a religious group, were the first to declare that slavery is a sin against man and God. They freed their slaves in the early 1800s. Many blacks served in the Revolutionary War. The 1776 United States Constitution makes no mention of slavery at all. In 1787, Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance, admitting these new states: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. The ordinance banned slavery in those states. But the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act gave slaveholders the right to recapture what they deemed their property anywhere and return those people to slavery in the slave states. By 1830, there were 2 million enslaved people in the Deep and Upper South. Many tried to escape and go to Canada, which outlawed slavery in 1833. Escaping the Deep South was nearly impossible, but freedom seekers in the Upper South states of Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia had a chance. Many blacks were free. They purchased their freedom. Slaveholders manumitted them, which means to free them, or soldiers earned their freedom. But many blacks were never slaves. Many indentured white women married slaves, and their children were free. Free blacks had papers declaring their status, but slaveholders and many slaves didn't like free blacks. Many free blacks moved to the free states and founded communities. Quakers left slave states and moved to the free states. They, and other abolitionists, including many black communities, started helping fugitive slaves, now called freedom seekers, on their journey to Canada. By 1840, the loose group had a name: the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was neither underground nor a railroad. It was a series of houses, barns, cellars, and other hiding places that sheltered the freedom seekers. Rail transportation was becoming popular. Routes were called lines, hiding places were called stations, and the people that provided food and shelter were called station masters. Conductors led freedom seekers to the next station, generally about 12 to 20 miles apart from each other. Often, a candle in the window identified a station. But contrary to popular belief, quilts were not used for road maps on the Underground Railroad. There was a large settlement of Quakers in Wayne County, Indiana, which was the home of Levi Coffin, known as the President of the Underground Railroad. Many of these Quakers moved to Cass County, Michigan around 1830, settling in Penn, Porter, and Calvin Townships, collectively known as Youngs Prairie at the time. They established the Birch Lake Meeting in 1837. While all Quakers hated slavery, they were also pacifists, and many did not want to break the law. This difference caused a split in the Birch Lake meeting. Some members became part of the Quaker line of the Underground Railroad. In 1843, they created the Youngs Prairie Anti-Slavery Meeting. The farms of Quakers Stephen Bogue, Zachariah Shugart, Josiah Osborne, Joel East, William Jones, Isaac Bonine, James Bonine, and Ishmael Lee were all known Underground Railroad stations. Non-Quakers Wright Maudlin and William Holman Jones of Calvin Township were slave runners. African-American Henry Shepherd was an Underground Railroad conductor. On the Quaker line of the Underground Railroad, freedom seekers crossed the Ohio River. Conductors took them to Wayne County, Indiana, and up to Vandalia, Michigan. The Illinois line went north in Illinois to the Chicago area, and then on to Niles, Michigan, and then to Vandalia. It's claimed over 1,500 freedom seekers were helped in Youngs Prairie. Zachariah Shugart and Henry Shepherd conducted them to the next station, Nathan Thomas in Schoolcraft. From there, they were conducted to Battle Creek and on to Detroit, where they crossed to Canada. Not all freedom seekers went to Canada. Some stayed in Youngs Prairie working on Quaker farms. In August 1847, 13 Kentucky slave catchers kidnapped 9 freedom seekers from Osborne, East, Shugart, Shepherd, and Bogue farms. Stephen Bogue raised a posse, and slave catchers, freedom seekers, and over 100 townspeople, both black and white, met at Odell's Mill. Quakers calmed the crowd and persuaded the slave catchers to go to the courthouse in Cassopolis and let a judge decide. Slave catchers were confident they would win because of the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law. In court, Judge Ebenezer McIlvaine, a secret abolitionist, allowed blacks to testify and bring charges against slave catchers. In spite of owner papers and Kentucky statutes, McIlvaine ruled against the slave catchers. All 13 kidnapped freedom seekers and about 40 others escaped on the Underground Railroad and were taken to Nathan Thomas in Schoolcraft and then on to Canada. Perry Sanford, a freedom seeker working on the Bogue farm, warned Stephen Bogue, and Hannah Bogue hid him upstairs in their house. Perry told his eyewitness story to a Battle Creek reporter in 1882. The Kentucky slave owners were incensed. In 1849, they brought civil suits in the district court in Detroit. These suits were eventually dismissed. This action led Congress to pass the 1850 Enhanced Fugitive Law, making all blacks subject to arrest and compelling all citizens to help slave catchers. In 1855, Michigan and other free states passed the Personal Liberty Acts to negate this 1850 law, leading to the Civil War. James E. Bonine arrived in Youngs Prairie in 1843 and married Sarah Bogue, daughter of Stephen Bogue, in 1844. They built their Greek Revival brick house sometime around 1845 and built their Gothic Revival carriage house sometime around 1850. Freedom seekers weren't kept in the Bonine house, but they were sheltered in the carriage house from around 1850 until the Civil War. James E. purchased over 1,600 acres around his home. In 1862, James E. Bonine created Bonine Elk Park east of the house, filled with elk, deer, and buffalo. It became an early Michigan state park. After the Civil War, the Benign House was remodeled, adding a north addition, porches, and a tower with its mansard roof as it looks today. Contrary to what some might think, the tower wasn't used for a lookout for slave catchers or a beacon for freedom seekers, as slavery was ended by the time the tower was built. The Benign family farmed Elk Park Farm over 100 years until it was sold in 1953. It was an early Michigan centennial farm. In 1853, James E. Benign purchased Section 33, about a half a mile south of M60 west of Calvin Center Road. He invited freedom seekers and free blacks to settle there and clear the land. Eventually, there were about 30 cabins and over 100 people in this community, called Ramp Town, for the wild leeks growing abundantly there. Ramp Town lasted until the turn of the century. After the Kentucky raid, slave catchers realized it was futile to come to Cass County. Many free blacks started arriving in the mid-1840s and early 1850s from North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Ohio, settling in Calvin and Porter Townships. Here is a list of black pioneers from the 1850 and 1860 Calvin and Porter Townships census. They had money and purchased property from Quakers and friendly land speculators, notably George Redfield. They established 3 churches and founded an anti-slavery society. On the 1860 Calvin Plat map, over 100 properties were shown as owned by black families. They created prosperous farms and were respected citizens of the community. They voted in the 1855 local elections and sent over 100 men to fight in the Civil War as a part of the 102nd United States Colored Troops. Many 102nd soldiers are buried in Chain Lake, Mount Zion, and Bethel Church cemeteries. In 1902, Booker T. Washington visited Calvin Township and wrote about it in 2 Generations Under Freedom. In 1837, Michigan ordered that neighborhood schools be built. Many of these schools in Calvin and surrounding townships were integrated. Evidence supports that Brownsville School No. 1, built around 1840, was the first and longest integrated public school in Michigan and perhaps the country. In 1841, Calvin District 1 reported to the Michigan Superintendent of Public Instruction. In 1846, Calvin Township paid school taxes to Cass County. On the 1850 Calvin Township census, black and white children are shown attending schools together. On the 1860 Plat map, 6 district schools are shown. Brownsville School No. 1 was integrated from the 1840s until it closed in 1957. You can visit brownsvilleschool.org for more information on that story.